Stith, welcome to the editorial board.
Jeremy, thank you very much.
So let's get right into it. What would you consider the most important part of the Secretary of State job?
Well, the Secretary of State is the Chief Elections Officer of the state of Wyoming, in charge of ensuring that by statute, in charge of ensuring that the state election laws are applied uniformly throughout the state.
How would you balance that against the importance of the business-related aspects of the Secretary of State's office?
Well, I'm a business lawyer by day. My day job is to deal with the laws that the Secretary of State administers: corporations, limited liability companies, uniform commercial code financing statements, notaries. I have, in addition, I'm a business lawyer in Rock Springs, Wyoming. So I feel my skill set fits well with the day-to-day operations of the job. I have also litigated 2 election law cases to the Wyoming Supreme Court. So I feel like all of the things that go on inside the office really are in my wheelhouse.
That gets us right to the next question. There's quite a handful of candidates for the Secretary of State's job, just with Republicans. How do you differentiate yourself from those candidates, from these other candidates?
Well, Jeremy, one thing that I've really liked about this race is that my campaign has really set the ideas agenda for the campaign. So, for example, I've introduced what I've called the Small Government Toolkit, in which we have 3 different tools. These are not government programs, but tools that are designed to make the Secretary of State's office both more efficient while reducing the number of employees that you need to have to do it. As you already know, Wyoming ranks #1 among the 50 states for having the highest percentage of its labor force employed by the federal, state, and local governments. I'm the small government candidate. I made a specific commitment on May 3rd at the Republican State Convention that as Secretary of State, I would, in a deliberate, orderly fashion, reduce the staff at the Secretary of State's office by at least 9% over 4 years. And when I first said that, I thought, well, this is the Republican primary. I'll just get outbid. The next person will say 12%, and the next person will say 15 or 20, and we'll have this competition to see who can cut the government more. To my surprise, all 3 of the candidates basically have gone on record, I believe with a Casper Star, saying that they're not in favor of reducing the number of staff, which to me is a big surprise, because the Secretary of State's office primarily deals in information, corporate filings, LLC filings. Elections is mostly electronic now at the Secretary of State level. State securities regulation. Since 2002, the number of staff in the office has increased by 19%. It's a small office, so from 26 people, authorized positions, to now 31, up 5, that's 19%. So really my proposal is to cut back about half the growth. What do we know about processing data is that you can crunch a lot more data today with fewer people than you could 12 years ago. So it's actually a surprise to me that there's been this growth in the number of staff. West of Green River, FMC Corporation has the largest trona mine in America, makes soda ash used for glass, detergent, toothpaste. Every year, FMC produces more soda ash with fewer people. And they're making a real thing. So it seems to me, and FMC does that not because it doesn't like its employees, but because if they don't trim down each year, if they don't become more productive each year, they go out of business.
But as I recall, some of the criticism was the cost of implementing systems that would allow that kind of cut.
In the business, the focus would be on the business division, where you've got about a third of the Secretary of State's office employees, about 10 or 11, who are engaged in this kind of white-collar, paper-based assembly line, a process that really hasn't changed much for a couple of decades. You would want to invest something, into information technology in order to create what I've called this express lane for online filings, because that would both make it more efficient, right? Right now it can take about 10 days to form a corporation, because it's 5 days processing time plus the mailing time back and forth for the paper. The Secretary of State's office does generate about $40 million in revenue. Any private business would automate that process because it makes sense to go ahead and streamline it. So there would be some investment in machines. But what's the alternative? Is the alternative that 20, 30 years from now, we're still going to be having a paper-based process for online filings? I mean, the federal court system has been doing original online filings for over a decade now, and the judiciary is not known for being particularly innovative. So, so what's the alternative? It is to make sense. It seems to me it's inevitable that we'll go to online filing because it's both better service, and ultimately you save. And what you do with these employees is they're mostly college-educated people in their 20s and 30s. You set them free to go off and do other things.
So talk to me about corporate registrations. Recent interview with Max Maxfield, he seemed fairly positive there wasn't any sort of Russian mafia involvement in corporate filings in Wyoming. I'm not sure I'm comfortable with that sort of certainty. Are you comfortable with how strict the registrations are, or would you tighten those up?
I would tighten it up, and it's actually going to be a lot easier than it sounds. Let me start with what I think is the fix is first, and then explain why I think it should be fixed. The fix would really just be adding 2 lines of disclosure onto the corporate filing forms. The first line, or series of questions, hopefully try to simplify it, would ferret out whether the person filing has genuine business ties to Wyoming. Do you live here, have employees here, own land here, or mineral interests here? Do you buy or sell anything here? And if you have any genuine business ties to Wyoming, I would want to leave you alone because we are business friendly. But if it turns out that you are in South America or Eastern Europe, and you want to form a Wyoming limited liability company, well, that's okay. But the next line on the form would say, okay, who are the beneficial owners of this company? And require that disclosure. Now, people who are doing legitimate things with their companies, they really shouldn't mind that. In other words, they shouldn't mind the disclosure. Bad actors, by contrast, will self-select out. They're not going to want to fill out the form. I contacted, my involvement with this dates back a long time. 24 years ago, I worked for a short time for the General Counsel's Office of the U.S. Treasury. In 1990 was the same year that the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network was established. And so I had lunch with the very first director of FinCEN and became interested in this whole idea of money laundering. In 2006, as you know, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network issued a report listing Delaware, Wyoming, Nevada as problem states because of the high degree of anonymity that the beneficial owners get in Wyoming. I've contacted FinCEN within the last month just to see if they've updated that report, although they don't give interviews about their dealings because they deal mostly with the FBI and DEA and CIA. They did confirm that they have not amended their report from 2006. So the real answer is, I sat down with the Deputy Secretary of State about 2 months ago, Pat Arp, competent, professional, very good at what she does. And I asked her the question, of the 112,000 companies that are calling Wyoming home, about how many of them have genuine business ties to Wyoming. And her informal estimate is that 25% of them have genuine business ties and 75%, or 3/4, do not. Okay, so if you're in a paper-based process, that means that you've got these 10 employees, 3 out of every 4 pieces of paper they're handling doesn't help Wyoming Main Street business at all. And 23 years ago, I wrote an article in the Georgetown Law Journal and made the recommendation that it's better off for society if companies want to call a state home, that company have a genuine business relationship to that state, that it's just sort of healthier in general. So the short answer to your question is, we don't really know what these people are up to. We really don't. So I don't want to exaggerate or say, oh, I know that really bad things are happening. But on the other hand, with as much anonymity in tens of thousands of companies that don't have any genuine business ties to Wyoming, what's the point of that? I don't think we should sell our good name for a $100 filing fee. There is anecdotal evidence of a problem, of course. I'm in the trenches. I'm a small-town lawyer in Rock Springs, so I see it. I got a call from a guy in Montevideo, Uruguay, wanted me to be his registered agent. So I did my little bit of background research on him and found out that he owes the IRS $4 million, which is why he's living in a non-extradition country. And so I called him back and said, life is short. I really don't want to spend it talking with the FBI. No thanks. So I decided I refused to be the registered agent for his company. But it didn't look like he was had any legitimate business purpose other than laundering his money so the IRS couldn't find it. I don't think that's such a good thing for Wyoming. More recently, in January of 2014, the Washington Post and the New York Times both reported that the Chinese government diverted for some reason, on one day in January of 2014, a significant portion of China's internet traffic to businesses with a principal place of business listed as one house in Cheyenne, Wyoming, right? So that's just curious, and no one really knows exactly what the backstory on that is. But that's anecdotal evidence that what the legislature thought it fixed in 2010, because it did amend the laws in 2010, it thought it fixed it, but it didn't really fix it.
I think that's going to be a challenge going forward. So do you want to be governor someday?
I'm trying to get to August 19th. That my focus right now is August 19th. Here's my view on that, and it's been a sort of brouhaha in the papers among the candidates about who really wants what. If some of the other candidates, if they want to be governor, I don't blame anyone for wanting to be governor. That's not my issue. But I think if you're campaigning for a job, you should want that job. I care a lot about this job. I care a lot about elections. I vote. I care a lot about corporations and making sure that they are achieving legitimate purposes. That's been what I've been doing for a living.
So an extension of that, maybe this is a little harshly put, but I think it's a fair question. You've been a frequent candidate for a number of public roles.
Yes.
Most recently this one.
Right.
Do you actually want this job, or is it having a public job that you want?
I think it's part of human nature, something larger than yourself. So for instance, as a lawyer, my job is to get good results for my clients, and I think I do. But sometimes you get a result for your client that's not necessarily the best result for the community or for society as a whole. It's easy to think of examples of that, especially when you do defense work. Right now I serve on the Rock Springs City Council. I enjoy that. I like that. One of the things I've liked about it is that I think I've been a voice for trying to rein in the natural tendency of government to grow. So there's nothing wrong. I mean, so yes, I do enjoy the idea of public service. I was happy. A year ago I voted against Rock Springs City Council budget. It was 8-1. I was the only dissenting voice on that because when I looked at the income statement, it had parentheses at the bottom. And I said, I'm not a finance guy, but parentheses to me mean negative numbers. And they acknowledged that the city was spending $250,000 more every month than it was taking in revenue. And I said, what's the plan for that? And they said, well, we don't really have a plan. So I voted against the budget. I felt vindicated because just 2 months ago, the mayor sent out an emergency spending freeze memo, and we had to cut $1.4 million in 60 days to make it balance. And this last budget we voted on 2 weeks ago, I voted in favor of that Rock Springs City Council budget because we were able to cut 3.8% from next year's budget. So, yes, public service, is that a good thing? Sure. It turns out, I mean, maybe it's just coincidence maybe here, but my skill set actually fits the Secretary of State's office really well.
So talk to me about SLIB. Membership of the board is an important role in the Secretary of State. Are you following the work of the board now? Can you tell me some recent examples of things they've been working on?
Oh, yes, I can. The State Loan Investment Board obviously is composed of five elected officials and works in connection with the Office of State Lands and Investment. The staff of the Office of State Lands and Investment makes recommendations for projects, and then SLIB votes on them, and also votes to approve projects recommended by the Wyoming Business Council. Okay. There's some SLIB projects that I think are good, and I've represented clients in front of SLIB. I've also litigated cases involving the authority of SLIB to spend money in a certain way. So I feel like I get it. I feel like I understand how the State Loan Investment Board works. Some projects I think are really good. So, for example, to pick one, there was 2 years ago, SLIB approved an expansion of an industrial park near Gillette, Campbell County, to expand the sewer system. Well, that makes sense to me because it's an appropriate role of government to get involved where the private sector is likely not to adequately fund the area. By contrast, that same meeting, SLIB also approved a recommendation from the Wyoming Business Council to give about $250,000, I think, to renovate a resort in Jackson. Now, to me, that doesn't make a lot of sense because there's no shortage of capital. There's no shortage of money to invest in real estate in Jackson. And so, to me, that's a kind of government interference that doesn't make a lot of sense because I think there are a lot of people across the state who might like to have their bathrooms renovated at taxpayer expense. So, generally speaking, just as from a philosophical point of view, I think it's the proper role of government to invest in those things where there's likely to be a market failure or government won't invest adequately. So education is clearly one, research, things like that, and then basic infrastructure.
Talk about recapture provisions. Where should recapture loan? Where should that money go and why?
I think the money should stay in the communities. I like the model that's being used under a separate consensus block grant program where the counties get together and they prioritize the projects. And if a project isn't ready to be funded in that community, then what happens is the money goes to the next project on that county's list of priorities. I would be in favor of having, on the recapture issue, instead of having this, what looks like a kind of power struggle going on between Cheyenne or the Business Council and the local communities, rather say, hey, this community, you got this, let's keep this in the community once we've decided we're going to invest here.
Besides SLID, what would you say is the most powerful role of the Secretary of State?
Well, I haven't thought of it in terms of what the most powerful role is. I think of it more in terms of what things are broken that need to be fixed. In addition to what we've talked about already. Of course, the Secretary of State sits on the State Building Commission and sits on the Board of Land Commissioners. On the State Building Commission, that could be a little more active in the future because the legislature just approved spending what seems like a lot of money, $250 million to renovate the Capitol. I've done a fair amount of construction litigation. There, I would be concerned to make two things would be my priorities in the State Building Commission. One would be to make sure that in the pre-qualification process you do not exclude Wyoming contractors unnecessarily. In other words, if the engineers decide in advance that the only people allowed to bid are people who have done a certain specialized work renovating capitals, then you've excluded everyone in Wyoming and no one gets to bid here. I think it would make sense to have some process because if the pre-qualification aspects of it wipe you out to begin with, then you're not even allowed to bid, right? The other thing about State Building Commission, things worth noting, is that for some reason, it's called the learning curve, I guess, is that if a project starts and then has a delay and then is restarted, there's between a 36 and a 50% inefficiency that happens. So your $250 million project, if you have a delay in it, suddenly becomes a $400 million project. Through really, strangely, nobody's fault other than the fact that you had this delay. It's a very odd phenomenon, but it's true, and I've seen it on construction projects. So what do you do about that? The State Building Commission has some role in saying to the engineers that you hire, look, get the design right first. Let's make sure our design is good so that when we start building this thing and renovating the Capitol, for example, that you don't have unnecessary delays, because those get very expensive in a hurry. On Board of Land Commissioners, again, no net increase of state lands and multiple use.
Any questions for me? So, in closing, feel free to say whatever you want, but I'd be curious to frame it this way. Why you? We've discussed this a little bit, but how would you say, in a full range, why you'd be the best fit for this job?
Sure. Thank you for the question. I am the small government candidate. And again, that's a surprise to me, that really any of the other three candidates in this race, all good people, really represent some version of the status quo. They really do. Because there's and I think it's unhealthy for our state to have a government employment sector that is as large as it is. We have 26% of our people, 1 in 4, according to the New York Times, who are employed by the federal, state, or local governments. And when I first saw that, I thought, well, that must be because we have a lot of federal workers, right? Or maybe it's because we're sparsely populated. Or maybe it's because we heavily invest in education. And it would be unfair to, punish the state government because you have a lot of federal workers or because you invest heavily in teachers or being sparsely populated, right? None of those factors would be an appropriate criticism. But I took a look at the March 14th issue of Governing Magazine. When you look at the non-education workers, Wyoming has 450 per 10,000 residents of non-education state and local workers. Okay, number one in the country. I thought, well, we're sparsely populated. Alaska is number 2 at 392 state and local government workers per 10,000 population. And they're less densely populated than we are, right? So for us to be tied for first place with Alaska, just to tie, you'd have to take out 58 per 10,000. Over 576,000 residents, that's 3,350 state and local government employees, just to be tied for first place for having the highest number of workers, okay? So I think my proposal is not very dramatic. 9% over 3 years, I'm saying 3 positions. So I don't want to say that, this is going to change the world to trim down the office by 9%. But we have to start somewhere. And it's because, look, a large government sector is not just expensive. And my argument is not primarily financial. My argument is more values-based, that our core values of individual liberty, self-reliance, and personal responsibility, that as the government sector grows, those values get chipped away. And it's a values issue that we need to right-size the government. I mean, right now, we have a higher percentage of government employment in Wyoming than France or Greece. It's quite stunning, really, And for now, we can afford it. And that's why we have such large sectors, because we've got the money from all our mineral royalty revenues. But with the war on coal production is down 14% in the last year. With the war on coal, small government may not be a choice. It may be thrust upon us. So I'm the small government candidate, and I think this election really is a referendum on how do voters feel? Do voters want smaller government, or are they content with the status quo? And I ask you for your vote.
Well, thank you so much for meeting with us.
Thank you.
Glad to be here.
It's a pleasure.